All right, Nando. Well, we have an international themed show today. I'm not doing a decode today, but Nando is, and he's giving us an update on what's happening in Brazil. So take it away.
Yes. Because if you look around the world these days, it's kind of hard to find political hope anywhere. I mean, Bernie and Corbyn were dispatched by the last gasp of neoliberal reaction within their parties. The left in Europe is utterly out of the picture. China continues to chug along with no real internal dissent, while Africa and the Middle East are still mired in a series of bitter ethnic conflicts and no end in sight. But there are some seeds of optimism in Latin America. Last year, Bolivians rose up against their right-wing coup government through a series of general strikes that paralyzed the country and forced new elections. In Ecuador, a 36-year-old leftist named Andrés Araúz won the first round of elections handily and is poised to take power in the second round. But this week saw some big news in Latin America's largest country, Brazil.
In Brazil, all eyes are turning to the 2022 presidential elections after a Supreme Court judge cleared the corruption convictions of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in a surprise decision.
That's right, baby. Lula is back. Lula is back. It's hard to overstate just how big of a deal this is. Brazil, as you may know, is more populous than the rest of South America combined. It's the fifth largest country in the world and home, of course, to the Earth's most important natural system, the Amazon rainforest, which is critical to our survival on this planet because it sucks out a huge chunk of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So what happens in Brazil matters to you. And I don't know if you've been paying attention, but since 2018, Brazil has been run by this guy. That's right. Double finger guns guy himself, Jair Bolsonaro, who is somehow dumber and more violent than even President Trump. He was able to win because Lula da Silva, who is by far the most popular politician in the country and was leading all the polls, was thrown in prison and barred from running in the presidential election. This was the result of a years-long so-called anti-corruption probe called Operation Car Wash, or Lava Jato in Portuguese. At the time, the global liberal establishment fawned over the brave heroes fighting the forces of corruption. This introduction by Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes was fairly typical of the press's tone.
Imagine if the Watergate investigation had led not only to the downfall of President Nixon, but also to allegations against his successor, plus the Speaker of the House, the leader of the Senate, a third of the cabinet, and more than 90 members of Congress. That gives you some idea of what's happening in Brazil right now. The country's stock market plunged this past week after a report that President Michel Temer had been caught on tape approving illegal payoffs, a potentially impeachable offense. Brazil's last president, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached. The country is suffering through one of its worst recessions in history and a crisis of leadership, caused in large part by a massive corruption investigation. It's known as Operation Car Wash. It's one of the largest bribery cases ever investigated, and it's being led by a small group of idealistic young Brazilian prosecutors and a crusading judge.
Wow. Small group of idealistic young Brazilian prosecutors. Anderson, tell me how you really feel. Now, at the forefront of this whole investigation was a judge named Sergio Moro. He became an international hero for his brave anti-corruption stance. And the scale of Lava Jato was immense. It took down dozens of politicians and business leaders. But the big prize was Lula himself. And in April of 2018, he was arrested for the alleged crime of receiving free renovations on an apartment in Brasilia, which he never even lived in. Again, the liberal press cheered this on. Here is the New York Times editorial board's reaction to Lula's imprisonment. Quote, however painful and disheartening the fall of a charismatic and dynamic leader, and however exhausted Brazilians must be from the political havoc of recent years, this is not the time to give up. History shows that battling corruption takes years, but also that incremental successes do change norms. Judges, like Sergio Moro, who has courageously led the prosecution in Operation Car Wash, have demonstrated that Brazil does have the institutions and means to take on even the most powerful and most popular of malefactors. There are still 6 months to go before the national elections. They should be spent in search of a leader who can ensure that the gains against corruption are not setbacks for democracy. Well, congratulations, New York Times. You got Bolsonaro. And those of us on the left always suspected that this was all just a politically motivated attack, that it was always just a way to smash the left, which was still in Brazil more popular than the right. In fact, it was very suspicious to those of us on the left that shortly after Bolsonaro won, Sergio Moro was named Brazil's justice minister. It seemed like a flagrant quid pro quo. I mean, you take out Lula, allow me to win, and I'll promote you. Well, it turns out that those of us on the left were correct.
Now the former judge who oversaw a multi-billion-dollar kickback scheme, nicknamed Operation Car Wash, is at the center of scandal himself and facing calls to step down. This follows the publication of leaked conversations and messages that he allegedly exchanged with prosecutors about the Lula da Silva case. Moro is allegedly heard sharing information and advice in an attempt to ensure that Lula da Silva would be found guilty, which is illegal.
We
can say that, in a way, the impartiality of the judgment could have been compromised, at least at the beginning. We see that there was a kind of orientation given by the judge to the prosecutors in the legal process.
Lula was convicted and prevented from running for president last year, clearing the way for current President Jair Bolsonaro's victory. Bolsonaro then named Moro justice minister and reportedly promised to give him the next available seat on the Supreme Court.
Well, the story of the anti-corruption crusaders' own corruption was broken by Glenn Greenwald and the team at The Intercept Brazil with a massive trove of leaked WhatsApp messages and documents. And I think it's worth letting Glenn explain what they found.
What this material shows are three key things. Number one, it shows that inside the prosecutor task force, they were talking openly about how they wanted to make sure that the Workers' Party lost the election. And we can talk about the specifics, but in particular, there was a judge who authorized Lula to give an interview from prison 12 days before the election, and they panicked, and they said, we need to stop this, because if Lula is allowed to be heard from, there's a good chance he will make PT win the election, and we need to put a stop to this. They said they were praying every day that PT doesn't return to power, PT being the Workers' Party. So this 5-year claim that they had, we don't have any preferences for parties, we don't care who wins elections, was an absolute lie. They were talking openly and explicitly about how their top priority was making sure PT didn't win the election, exactly what people have been accusing them of. Secondly, just like in the US, a judge is required to be neutral. A judge can't favor one side or the other. And there's long been a suspicion that Judge Moro, when he was ruling on these cases, like finding Lula guilty, finding other left-wing leaders guilty, and people from other parties guilty, that he was in fact collaborating in secret with the prosecutors to design the case. They vehemently and angrily denied this accusation. The head of the prosecutorial task force, who's a national hero in Brazil, Delton Dallagnol, wrote a book in which he said, these accusations are outrageous, they're disgusting. We have video of Judge Moro being asked about this, and he was so angry about it that he actually scoffed at it with a smile, saying, people talk about this as though it's Judge Moro's prosecution or Judge Moro's strategy. He said, people don't understand. Judges in Brazil have no role in prosecuting people. Our value is one of passivity. We simply listen to both sides, listen to the evidence, and make decisions. What the conversations that we publish show between Judge Moro and the head of the prosecutorial task force is that Judge Moro, in fact, was constantly directing, constructing, designing the entire prosecution, screaming at them when they were doing things that he thought were wrong, telling them how to better fortify the case, not just against Lula, but against other people. He was basically the commander of the prosecutorial team, and then walking into court as though he were sitting judging Lula's case and others as a neutral arbiter. So everything that they vehemently denied to the public they were doing, in fact, they were doing for years, as these documents show. And then the third key revelation, as you said, is that the specific case for which they prosecuted Lula, namely the charge that he had received what they call a triplex apartment in order to make it sound very glamorous, when in fact it's kind of run down and shoddy, and Lula had the capability to buy it 100,000 times over if he wanted. But the charge was he received this triplex apartment and renovations to it in exchange for helping this construction company get contracts that they knew themselves 3 days before they indicted him that they didn't have the evidence sufficient to show his guilt or even to justify why this case belonged with them. But they just decided they were going to go forward anyway because they knew they had a judge in Judge Morrow, now Minister Morrow, single-mindedly devoted to the goal of imprisoning Lula, and not just imprisoning him, but doing so in time to make him ineligible to run for 2018's election out of fear that PT would win the elections.
So now Lula is back. Now, I think it's worth taking a step back because he's poised to challenge Bolsonaro in the next presidential elections in 2022. But I think we need to understand Lula's legacy and what he means for Brazil and Latin America. And for that, I would be remiss if I didn't turn to our dear departed brother and comrade, Michael Brooks. Let's hear Mike tell Jesse the Body Ventura just who Lula is.
Lula went from being a very popular president in Brazil to a prisoner convicted on corruption charges. For those who don't know, talk about Lula's presidential legacy, Michael. Why was he so popular?
Jesse, thanks for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I think that this story does have major consequences for all of us. He lifted 40 million people out of poverty. That's the top line. 40 million Brazilians went from being in poverty to basically being somewhere in the lower middle class. He eliminated hunger. That was recognized by the UN. And he also pursued, and I think that this tells kind of more of the broad story we'll get to later, he really tried to pursue a non-aligned foreign policy for Brazil. So he wasn't in any way sort of hostile to anybody, really. I mean, he was trying to synchronize a foreign policy that charted an independent course, including things like some of the pre-negotiations for what later became the Iran deal were conducted by Lula. So by the time he left office in 2010, he was internationally recognized, he had sky-high approval ratings, and that was the story of his presidency.
I interviewed Jesse Ventura once, and I remember Mike and I used to always talk about how cool he was. So Lula's presidency transformed Brazil. It is one of the most successful left-wing presidencies ever. His signature reform was known as Bolsa Familia, which was a cash transfer scheme for the poor that lifted millions out of poverty. But even before he became president, Lula had already transformed Brazil through his remarkable rise through the labor movement. As I mentioned at the top, Brazil is a massive country. It's incredibly diverse and complex, with massive industrialized cities like Sao Paulo and Amazonian outposts like Manaus and everything in between. Brazil imported more African slaves than any other country in the Western Hemisphere. So its history is a very violent one, and its society is terribly unequal, and its social divisions run deep. In 1964, a US-backed coup instituted a military dictatorship in order to thwart a budding social democratic movement. The dictatorship was brutal. It ruled through torture, murder, censorship, and repression. But by the 1970s, the labor movement was gaining steam, especially in the car manufacturing plants around Sao Paulo. And at the forefront of that movement was an uneducated factory worker who had lost a finger to the machine, Lula da Silva. Here's the Christian Science Monitor on that time. In 1979, more than 170,000 metal workers paralyzed the three main industrial suburbs of Sao Paulo, then known as the ABC region. The state intervened to bring large-scale striking to a halt, but it turned into a violent confrontation between armed forces and the unions. Strikes continued in the south of Brazil, and in the fall of 1979, the government agreed to a new wage law that adjusted wages every 6 months. Quote, "These strikes mark the beginning of the end of the dictatorship," says Brodwin Fisher, a history professor at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Strikes were led primarily by the Metalworkers Union under the leadership of Luiz Inácio da Silva, known as Lula. They marked the creation of Brazil's Workers' Party, which is one of the nation's main political parties today. Mr. da Silva went on to serve as Brazil's president between 2003 and 2010. The military dictatorship went away in 1985, and it was thanks, in large part, to the massive strikes led by Lula. So it's not just that his presidency was a success, it's that he utterly transformed the country through his life's work. Of course, for someone like Barack Obama, that was not enough. In his memoir, Obama wrote of Lula, quote, "He had the scruples of a Tammany Hall boss, and rumors swirled about government cronyism, sweetheart deals, and kickbacks, that ran into the billions. Thanks, Obama. Anyway, Lula understands that the power of international capital, of whom Obama is a dutiful servant, will work to destroy any leader who tries to help the poor.
Ou seja, na América Latina, toda vez que apareceu presidente que tentou fazer política social, ele foi derrubado. Todas as vezes. A elite brasileira e a elite de outros países não aceitam uma política de desenvolvimento que tem inclusão social.
Well, so what now? Well, everyone assumes that Lula will run again in 2022 in what will be a political cage match for the ages. ages. Bolsonaro versus Lula. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. I think Jesse Ventura should be the announcer. And the good news is Lula seems to have the upper hand at the moment.
James, how popular is Lula da Silva now, and how much of a threat could he pose politically to President Jair Bolsonaro?
It's all indications are that his popularity is increasing very quickly. He gave a press conference yesterday, which was extremely well received, even by the media that had been very hostile towards him in Rede Globo, the global news network. I think his popularity will only increase as he starts carrying out a campaign to travel through the country to speak to the people.
Now, of course, a lot can change from now until the election. They can try and use the courts to stop Lula again, although that may be difficult. But as Benjamin Fogel writes in Jacobin, there could be even something more nefarious. Quote, "The elephant in the room is how the Brazilian military will respond." In a recent book, former Armed Forces head Eduardo Villas-Boas admitted that he and other senior generals attempted to exert pressure on the Supreme Court through Twitter the night before a ruling that would determine if Lula would be imprisoned and ineligible to run in the 2018 elections. But for now, Lula is livre, and he is eligible to run. The Workers' Party is still the largest party in the country, and Lula himself is the most popular politician in the country. And there is hope that alongside figures like AMLO in Mexico, Arce in Bolivia, Fernandez in Argentina, Araújo in Ecuador, and of course, Lula in Brazil, the pink tide will get a sequel in Latin America. Hopefully this time they can build on the foundation set in the early 2000s and go beyond the reforms that lifted up 70 million people out of poverty.
Lot of good news today regarding Latin America. Obviously, the segment you just did, the interim president for in Bolivia, Janine Áñez, I believe, just got arrested. And that was, of course, a product of the coup that took place in Bolivia. So a lot of great news. But I want this to be more than just a story in time. I think there are important lessons to learn from what happened to Lula that the left, particularly in the United States, should be aware of and think about critically. And that is the way that the right wing propagates, certain narratives that tend to be appealing to the left, right? But it's all empty BS. Like in the case of Lula, they used the issue of corruption. And obviously corruption is something that most people care about, but the left also cares about. And so painting him as this corrupt politician was the right kind of propaganda to get people to turn on him, right? And so we should be aware of similar tactics that are used here in the United States. I think a good example right now is the topic of cancel culture and how it gets twisted to fit the narrative that the corporate Democrats want to put out there, right? So we talked about that last week with Kirsten Sinema, voting against the $15 an hour minimum wage. And then she uses identity politics, for instance, and cancel culture certainly connected to that because identity politics usually leads to the cancellation of someone. But she used like the fact that she's a woman to say that any type of backlash or criticism is sexism. We've seen prominent, progressives running for office get hit with all sorts of insane accusations of sexism, racism, things that the left clearly cares about. And it's just frustrating to see how easily like those narratives seep into people's consciousness and convinces them that someone who's been fighting for the working class, someone who has the right politics is actually a bad person because they've been painted in a certain way by political opponents, and I just see it happening over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, there's different flavors of it, but a lot of the same things happened. I mean, if you remember Jeremy Corbyn, who we interviewed on this show, and like it's just like you know it when you see it, just a kind, decent man, was smeared as some sort of violent anti-Semite, and that narrative kind of stuck because the media was just like telling it over and over and over and over again, and it's only a matter of time before something like that sticks. Bernie Sanders was somehow seen here by the mainstream media as some sort of crypto misogynist, racist, like crazy things, like a guy who was arrested on his college campus fighting for civil rights in the 1960s and marched, with Martin Luther King and all this stuff, like is somehow now warped and seen as a racist. In Latin America, you see any leftist leader, whether it's Evo Morales in Bolivia or Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, seen as some sort of kind of dictatorial, authoritarian strongman. That's the narrative that comes out. And it's just like, you have to, at a certain point, you just have to see what's going on here. Like as Lula said in that clip, he's like, any politician who tries to do anything in terms of economic development for the poor will get smeared to a degree that is just perfectly consistent, and often, I mean, this is especially true of liberals. They'll be like, well, he had some great achievements, but he did the corruption stuff, and then you're like what corruption stuff? And then they can't really tell you exactly what, but it's just the narrative is out there, it's like, well, yeah, Bernie, but like, he's got problems with race. And you're like, what problems with race? Like, tell me one thing that he has that is like a problem. And it's like, well, they don't tell you because it's just kind of the narrative is out there. So it really is, you have to be so skeptical of the mainstream media and how they cover anything on the left. I mean, this isn't to say like, you don't think critically or anything like that, but like you just have to be incredibly wary of mainstream media narratives about the left. I mean, it's so consistent no matter who it is. Like Lula did everything right. I mean, this is something that Mike would talk about a lot. He did everything supposedly right. He didn't do like the Chavez stuff, right? Like he wasn't too much of a, like Chavez was a troll. Like he knew how to rile up the Western establishment. Like, he like went to the United Nations and said that he smelled sulfur whenever George W. Bush walked into the room and things like that. Like he knew how to do that. And like, he like as a military man, he had a slight kind of, authoritarian kind of bent to him. He had that kind of, Lula did everything right. Like he played by the rules, so to speak. And they got him anyway, like,
yeah, of course,
they got him anyway. So yeah, I mean,
but that's a lesson as well, right? That's a lesson as well, that if you play by the rules, if you go out of your way to not threaten the liberals, they're still going to have it out for you. And so, the fight for the left, it never really ends, right? One victory doesn't mean that you can just kind of like be calm and complacent and you don't have to deal with efforts to destroy you. And the thing that does worry me, you touched on this a little bit, and I think that your analysis on it is right. There is a possibility of Lula facing a retrial because the judge didn't make the decision that was made because of evidence, and there is evidence, thanks to the Intercept reporting, indicating that this was a politically motivated action, right? What the judge said was, okay, well, there are jurisdictional issues considering that Lula was tried in an area where the crime didn't happen, where the alleged crime didn't happen. Right? I wish that the ruling was different. It's basically a technicality, right? Mm-hmm. Hopefully, if he does face a retrial, the reporting that's happened since he was imprisoned will finally like just clear him of any wrongdoing, because he didn't do anything wrong. It was a politically motivated prosecution. But I bring that up because I don't think that I don't think that Lula's in the clear yet. Like, the fight continues. So while it's good to celebrate this victory, I don't think that it's the end. I think that he's a huge threat to multinational corporations. I think he's a huge threat to business interests, and they're going to keep fighting. So it's definitely a story to keep close eyes on, and more importantly, to be incredibly critical of narratives that play out in corporate media. Because you just have to read the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian at this point, and the New York Times in a more skeptical light when it comes to these foreign policy issues.
Yeah. No, I mean, the what you mentioned about the jurisdictional issue. I mean, I've seen, the media cover, have like Brazilian constitutional scholars who say like, oh, well, it seems very difficult that they can do it in time because of the way the courts work and things like that. I mean, it's obviously like they can just make up new rules and do, like, there's not like, these things aren't set in stone, and they can just make up a new rule and figure out some way to bar him from running again. I think that the damage to the credibility of the judicial system because of these revelations about Sergio Moro. I mean, it's hard to imagine a figure like him in America. There hasn't ever really been a figure like him, like this kind of crusading judge who became such a hero around the world. I mean, when I was researching the segment, he was invited to international conferences, to universities around, very prestigious universities around the world to talk about like leadership and things like that. Like, there isn't quite a figure like that we can understand here in the United States. And his fall from grace is so dramatic, and that the whole system is so dramatic, and it's just so obvious to even, like, as the guy in the clip said, that even Globo was like, which is highly, very anti PT, was like, well, Lula made some good points in that speech. Like, it's just, it would be hard to see, it would be hard to imagine them being able to muster the energy to do that again in the same way. That's why, like, Benjamin Fogel's like, well, maybe they have to, if they really want to stop him, they have to go to they have to pull the nuclear option and get the military involved, which would obviously be terrifying. But so yeah, I mean, it seems like the Brazilian elite is desperately going to try to find some sort of candidate, some sort of like Emmanuel Macron or Justin Trudeau type figure to run. But it just, I don't know. It just seems like from all I can gather and from all I can read, that it's, the center cannot hold in Brazil. It's either Lula or Bolsonaro, and you got to choose. And so I like the odds in that fight.